My name is Kim Gallo, and I have the honor of leading this school. And you're about to find out why. Each year, we invite speakers to our school, and our students spend time and research and thoughtful conversation about the issue that we identify for World Affairs Month. This particular issue is near and dear to my heart. I am a grandchild of 2 immigrants, and I proudly framed my grandmother's naturalization picture, and very much the way you'll see in the Tenement Museum. I heard those stories, the stories of hope, and the stories of challenge, and the absolute awe that you were coming to a place that was going to give you and your children a better life. My grandmother and grandfather only went to school until the 3rd and 5th grade. They were asked to leave so that they could help out on the family farm. And because of that, they had such a love and a wanting and a longing for education. I'm absolutely certain that's why I became a teacher. And that's why I love what I do so much. So while this topic is inspiring to me, what I truly want you to pay attention to is how inspiring these students are. I just told them before the presentation started that they say such important and well thought out things that I always feel like I want to cheer like I'm in a football game. But, you know, really at a panel discussion, it's not okay to say, whoop, whoop, you know. So I'll try not to, but no promises. You'll see our core values and guiding beliefs in action in a very thoughtful and intelligent way. You'll see that these students haven't just prepared for a day. They're preparing for their lives. They're preparing for important futures. And they're doing it so well. And I'm so proud to even be associated with them. So on behalf of Superintendent Bennett, Mr. Dennis, and our teachers and our board members in attendance, and all of the people who support Chappaq, I'd like to welcome you, and I'd like to challenge you to be just as smart as they are when it comes time for question and answers. Now I put you on the spot. Thank you.
Speaking of football, if anyone needs the restroom, you go right through that door. You'll see a chair with a New York Giants towel on it from 2011 when they were in the playoffs, the last moment of glory that we had as a Giants fan. You go right, there's a men's room. You go left by the copiers, and there's a women's room. So thank you for being here. Another robust turnout. We absolutely appreciate everyone's support. For continuing to come out. This is our 16th forum now. We've been so blessed to have so many speakers give their time to our school. And I know Kevin Jennings, who really has no affiliation with us at all. I sent him an email back in November. It was way too long. I had no expectation for a response. And I can tell you exactly where I was when we got the response, eating a peanut butter cup in the coffee room before a meeting with the principal. So we really appreciate you being here and giving your time for us. Thank you for that. We have a lot of people to thank for today. The administration, as Mrs. Gallo mentioned, throughout all the way to the top. Just people that helped set this up. Karen Wapatek with the sound. I turned it off. That's pretty standard for me. I know I'm pretty loud anyway, but it didn't feel. So where's the on button?
This is where I get my jolly.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
How's that? Is that better? Excellent. Sorry about that. Just Karen Wapatek with the audio, Betsy for setting up, everyone, Andrew for helping keep all this together and make our jobs a lot easier. I actually have the easiest job because we have such amazing kids who are ready to talk about such complex issues. The Chappaq Student Project Foundation has sponsored our desserts after, as well as the wonderful dinner that the students will have after as well. The community continues to support us in all kinds of ways, and most importantly, our students. I just want to take a quick moment. I need a note card to do this because I can't talk about their accomplishments without a little bit of help. Wilson has been a World Affairs panelist for 3 years. He's also been in Model UN for 3 years. He served on the African Union as a sophomore at Model UN at Harvard. All these are at Harvard. The UN Economic and Social Council for Asia and the Pacific, and this year on the IMF. So he's been a real leader for us, as well as Bridget, in helping our new panelists, first-time panelists, ease into this. Bridget is also a 3-year veteran of World Affairs. Both Bridget and Wilson, 3 years, interacted with Dr. George Rupp, Ambassador William Lewis, and now Mr. Jennings. Bridget served on the World Health Committee, the specialized NGO, and then this year, the Special Counsel on Terrorism. Liz Dunzig is a junior. This is her first year as a panelist. She has 2 years in Model UN. Last year, she served on the Reform and Human Rights Council, and this year, the Office of Drugs and Crime. So really tackling important issues. And this year, we were Saudi Arabia. So, Lily Scher is our next panelist. She's a junior as well. This is her first year as a panelist. Her first year as a Model UN member, she served on the legal committee. She did an outstanding job. Isabel Eddy is a first-year panelist as well, and she has 2 years in Model UN in the legal committee last year, and this year in the social, humanitarian, and cultural committee, so tackling difficult issues. Oscar Cespedes, I'm doing this backwards, but Oscar's on the end there. This is his first year as a World Affairs panelist, 2 years in Model UN. As a sophomore, joined NATO, which was a very small specialized committee, and then this year, Political Decolonization Committee as well. And lastly, Rebecca Raz. She served this year, this is her first year as a panelist. She served on Model UN as well this year on disarmament, international security, and she took the SATs this morning. So, not me another kid who, on a Saturday, spends 3 hours taking a test and then comes to talk about such complicated issues. So everything in our world seems to have been politicized. You can't find one. I was reading this morning on The Economist one article about even the women's pay gap has become politicized and partisan. And it's just amazing. And today's not about political persuasions, and it's not about anyone trying to persuade your politics. We all have them. But we have awesome, dynamic, smart, engaged kids who are willing to talk about such a powerful issue and an issue that has shaped our nation, who come from different backgrounds, who don't always see the world the same way, maybe politically, family, all those things, but they come together and they look at the world as it is, not as it fits into some box. So you're going to be as impressed as I am, I'm sure, by them, and we look forward to hearing them. Lastly, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Jennings, but Kevin, we can't tell you how much we appreciate you being here. You've always been on the right side of history. We appreciate you being here and talking with our community and our students, and we look forward to your talk. Thanks a lot, Kevin.
First of all, Chris and I have had a lot of email exchanges. I realized the number one thing I forgot to ask was, what should I wear? I'm so underdressed compared to the students now. I feel like a schlub. Can you hear me if I don't use the mic? Because I kind of hate carrying the mic around, but if you really need me to. If you need me to use the mic, raise your hand. Okay, so I'm going to assume you can hear me then, since nobody raised their hand. This lecture, as you can see, I originally developed to give at Southbury Public Library, which is where I live, and I called it the Nation of Immigrants, and I put in a question mark. And the reason I put in a question mark was, you might know that last year, the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service removed in the welcoming document to the United States, it used to say, we are a nation of immigrants. And U.S. Customs and Immigration removed that phrase from the document that welcomes people to the United States last year for the first time in recent memory. So I decided to call the lecture a Nation of Immigrants with a question mark, because are we indeed a nation of immigrants anymore? Is that still true? And how many of you have ever been to the Tenement Museum? Okay, so some of you have been. Let's see, is this going to work for me? Oh, we need our AV wizard back again, I think. Maybe this is not on again. It's better if I could actually use it.
The superintendent's here, so I have to show her how.
Exactly. This is why she gets the big bucks, y'all. There we go. It's worked. See? Let's give her a round of applause. So the Tenement Museum is located at 97 Orchard Street on Manhattan's Lower East Side, which is kind of America's foyer. Generation after generation of immigrants have passed through the Lower East Side on their way to becoming Americans since it first was built in the early 1800s. In our particular building, 97 Orchard Street, there are 21 identical 3-room, 325 square foot apartments. Between when the building was built in 1863 and when it was condemned in 1935, 7,000 people lived in the building. The largest family we've ever documented living in one of the apartments was a family of 12. What you think about that for a second? 12 people in 3 rooms sharing 325 square feet. So if you're ever feeling crowded at home, think about that for a second. Now, our museum was started in 1988, 30 years ago, by a woman named Ruth Abram. Ruth had a very particular point of view and a very particular vision for our museum, which is described in this video.
For almost 30 years now, the museum has been using buildings like the building where we are right now to understand and experience the families who actually lived here.
By understanding history through the lens of individual lives and individual stories, we help people develop a sense of empathy and understanding that a million textbooks can never do.
I really wanted to bring Americans home to meet our forebears before they were acceptable, before they knew the customs of the country, before they had any money, before they knew the language, and to help them see that the immigrants on the streets of New York and other parts of our country today are in the very same shoes. That was the idea of the Tenement Museum. And it was to promote tolerance through the telling of history.
This was a very radical thing because when Ruth Abram started the Tenement Museum 30 years ago, most museums told you the lives of the rich and famous. And Ruth had a vision that everyone's life was important and everyone's life deserved to be retold.
I've been here 16 years. Once I came here and I observed a tour, I couldn't believe that they were talking about my family. Even though my family immigrated from the Dominican Republic, I felt the connection right away. I started to cry. I got very emotional because I didn't think that my story was important. I felt like, wow, I can't believe that. My story is important. My family story is important.
So Ruth kind of turned the traditional museum on its head. The traditional museum, places like Mount Vernon where Washington lived or Monticello where Jefferson lived, told you the lifestyles of famous, important people who were usually rich, they were usually white, they were usually male. And Ruth said, I'm going to tell you the stories of people who usually get forgotten by history, poor immigrants. And that is what we've been dedicated to doing for the last 30 years. When you come to our museum, you take a tour of a recreated apartment. What we've done is we've researched the families that live in the building, and we tell you exactly what their lives were like, beginning with the Moores, who were an Irish family that lived there in the 1860s. We now have 2 buildings. It ends with the story of the Wongs, who were a Chinese family who came in 1965. So we tell you over 100 years of history through the lens of individual families who immigrated to our country at different time periods. Now, immigrants have not, this is the myth about American immigration. We all know that picture, the Statue of Liberty, and we probably all know Emma Lazarus's famous poem. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That is our image of America as a nation that always welcomes people from other countries. But the reality is the truth has been a little more complicated throughout our history. First of all, the first Americans, I love this particular poster, they weren't all that thrilled by the original immigrants who did not have the most positive impact on their way of life. This cartoon I love shows Native Americans building a wall. It says at the bottom, it says, they say they're building a wall because too many of us enter illegally and won't learn their language or assimilate into their culture. In fact, the arrival of white people was a complete and utter disaster for Native Americans. If you look at simply the population figures, there was approximately 10 million Native Americans living on the North American continent in the 1400s. 400 years later, there were approximately 500,000. So 95% of the native population was wiped out by the coming of white people in this country, and is still to this day not recovered. There are approximately 2.5 million Native Americans living in America today, so we're still at only 25% of the pre-Columbian population of Native Americans. Now, some of our early leaders were very positive, though, about immigration. George Washington was famous for saying, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respected stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges, if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment." Not every founding father agreed with George Washington. This was Franklin Roosevelt. Benjamin Franklin. In 1755, he wrote an essay called Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, People of Countries, etc. And he lived in Pennsylvania, which had been founded by English Quakers. But there had been the first wave of non-English immigrants to our country in the early 17 and mid-1700s, which were largely German-speaking Protestants. Ben Franklin did not like this, and he wrote, "A colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion." So he was not thrilled with the arrival of the Germans. And if you deconstruct Ben Franklin's quote here, you actually see many of the themes of anti-immigrant prejudice which will pervade through American history down to 2019. First of all, they will Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them. These newcomers will undermine and corrupt our culture. They will ruin American culture. Secondly, they will never adopt our language. They won't learn to speak English. Now, how many of you have German ancestry? Did that turn out to be true? I'm not lecturing in German. Most of you seem to have mastered the language at some point. But this was a real fear in the mid-1700s that German immigrants would never learn English, they would never learn our culture, they would never learn our language, and they would not acquire our complexion. Now, this may be confusing to you because you're thinking Germans are white. But at that point in history, Germans were seen as being of a different race than people of Anglo-Saxon origin from the British Isles. And they were seen as being racially inferior. So you see the various forms of prejudice towards immigrants, which we still hear today. Prejudice based on race, prejudice based on culture, prejudice based on national origin, and prejudice based on language. Yep, and religion, which will come up actually more in the 19th century, but that is really critical as well. So Ben Franklin kind of gives you a preview of coming attractions, although he's talking about the people we now refer to as the Pennsylvania Dutch, who we think are so quaint nowadays. He did not think we're so quaint. Religion comes up next. The next wave of white immigrants coming to the country really are the Irish and Germans, who come, German Catholics, who come in the 1840s and 50s. These folks were considered foreign for two reasons. First of all, because they practiced a different religion. At least the Germans who came in the 1700s were also Protestants. These people were Catholic. That was considered very unsettling to Protestant Americans, who once again saw this as people who would never assimilate to our country and who had divided loyalty. They were not only loyal to America, they were loyal to the Pope. So another trope about immigrants comes about, which is that immigrants aren't really loyal to the United States. And what's interesting in this cartoon is the different drinks that the Irish and the Germans drank. The Irish drank whiskey, and the Germans drank lager beer. Now you're like, who cares? But lager beer was different than what the English drank. The English drank ale. And lager beer was considered to be literally like poison by the original white Americans. And they were very troubled by the coming of these new drinks, which they thought were poisonous and bad and were going to corrupt people in much the same way today we think of drugs as corrupting people. They thought of these new forms of alcohol as corrupting people. So you see some of these themes in different forms in the past, but following the same tropes. And this prejudice took very, very specific forms. This was a want ad in New York City. They wanted a German Protestant. Now the Germans are okay, by the way. Notice that 100 years ago we didn't like them so much, but now we want the German Protestant. Or colored girl for general housework in a small family. Good reference required. No Irish need apply. Call it 121 Portland Avenue near Merton. No Irish need apply. So this prejudice took dangerous forms, and not just things like denying people's jobs, but actually it took a violent turn at times too. This is from what was called in the 1850s a race riot, because remember the Irish were thought of as a different and inferior race to the English in the 1850s. A convent and church were attacked in Philadelphia. Over a dozen people were killed by Protestant rioters who were troubled by the incoming Catholics in the city. And this was not unusual to see that kind of level of violence towards Catholics in the mid-1800s of the United States. The next big wave of immigrants coming to America comes in the 1850s and 60s in the form of the Chinese. The Chinese come drawn primarily by the gold rush in California and also to help build the transcontinental railroads, which were constructed largely by Irish laborers coming from the east and Chinese laborers coming from the west. As you know, they met in the middle in Utah when they united the two railroads in 1867. So the Chinese come and they are deeply, deeply, deeply unwelcomed. If the Irish were seen as a foreign race, you can imagine how foreign the Chinese were seen as being. And soon, political parties were formed with the express purpose of excluding the Chinese from America's society. The Working Men's Party of California, that was the only platform of the party, was keep the Chinese out. And they succeeded. The first law pertaining to immigration in American history is passed in 1882. Until 1882, anyone could get on a boat, come here, get off, and join the country. No questions asked. In 1882, Congress, at the urging of the Working Men's Party of California, passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, which says that Chinese may no longer enter the country. This act will remain in place in some form until 1965. So for 83 years, and by the way, it was expanded in the 1920s to include all people of Asian descent, not just Chinese. Japanese, Filipino, Southeast Asian, South Asian, etc. It was expanded to cover all people of Asian descent. But in 1882, for the first time, we started having regulation of immigration to this country in response to the influx of Chinese. That is a specific story we tell at the museum. As I mentioned before, one of the stories we tell is the story of a Chinese family that came in 1965, the Wong family. This is Mrs. Wong and her daughter Ya-Ping Wong. They came in 1965. Mrs. Wong had married her husband was an American. And when the laws were changed in 1965, and I'll explain about that later in the talk, the priority was given to new immigrants of family reunification. So she was able to move here to be with her husband and to bring their daughter. And it's kind of a great story because she's very excited to finally be able to move to the United States and be with her husband. She's coming from Hong Kong. She has Ya-Ping, who's 9. She has a 1-year-old baby because Mr. Wong had come back a year earlier to help prepare her for the move, and guess what? They had a baby 9 months later. So she has a 9-year-old, she has a 3-month-old, she has all of her stuff she's hauling, she has a rice cooker because you can't buy those in the States at the time, and it's the Autumn Harvest Festival, so she has a bag full of mooncakes because you can't buy Chinese food in America in 1965 because there's so few Chinese people. She's exhausted already by the time she gets to the airport from schlepping 2 kids and all this junk. So she goes to throw the mooncakes away. We interview Mrs. Wong to prepare the exhibit. Mrs. Wong says, I just couldn't carry it anymore. And my 9-year-old daughter steps up and says, don't worry, Mommy, I will carry the cakes. And I thought that was the moment in which my daughter became a woman, and she stepped up to help our family. The next day, we interviewed Yat-Ping Wong, who today is a Yale graduate and a librarian at the Library of Congress in Washington. We said, Yat-Ping, do you remember this story? That was the moment your mom said you became a woman. Yat-Ping said, I was a 9-year-old and my mother was throwing away a bag full of cake. Why do you think I took the cake? So, this is a picture of what was, until 9/11, the largest terrorist act in American history. By the turn of the 20th century, with the exclusion of the Chinese, the new immigrant groups coming into America are largely from Eastern Europe, primarily Jewish, and from Southern Europe, primarily Italian. In 1919, there was the famous J.P. Morgan bombing, in which a bomb was set off on Wall Street, at the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street, outside the headquarters of J.P. Morgan. Over 40 people were killed. By the way, if you ever go down to New York and you go to Wall Street at J.P. Morgan, that building is still there. It's now a condo building, but you can still see the pockmarks from the shrapnel of that explosion on the facade of the building today. So, largest terrorist attack in American history at the time. And who gets blamed for it? Immigrants. Even though no one was ever caught and prosecuted for the bombing, it was stereotyped that Italian immigrants were to blame for the terrorist attack, bringing yet another trope of anti-immigrant prejudice to the fore, which is that immigrants come here to commit terrorism. Sound familiar? This leads shortly thereafter to the next and most comprehensive immigration law we ever passed in the United States, the 1924 National Origins Act. By the early 1920s, the influx of Italians and Jews has profoundly alarmed the still largely Anglo-Saxon, Northern European population of the United States. Italians and Jews, once again, practice a foreign religion, Catholicism and Judaism. They speak a different language, they eat different foods, they are a different race. Once again, the thing has shifted now to Northern Europeans, by which is meant Irish, English, and Germans, and the Nordic people, who are considered the superior race, versus Southern and Eastern Europeans. You notice the superior race keeps changing. And that basically about every 50 to 100 years, the people who used to be the inferior race get absorbed into the superior race, and whoever is last off the boat becomes the next inferior race. You notice how that keeps happening throughout history? First, the German Protestants were inferior, then the Irish Catholics were inferior, and then Italians were inferior. Well, we don't think of Italians as a separate race today. We think of Italians as white people. But in 1920, they were thought of as a separate race. And there was a conscious decision by our government to change the literal complexion of America. The National Origins Act in 1890 goes back to the census of 1890, which, not coincidentally, is before the large influx of Italians and Jews to America, and sets quotas. Says you can have up to 2% of your nation's percentage of the population of the United States in 1890. And that's how many people can immigrate to your country, from your country to the United States. How convenient, because virtually no Italians and no Jews from Eastern Europe lived in the United States in 1890. So, let me make this really, really clear for you. In the early 1920s, on average, about 220,000 Italians arrived a year in the United States. You know what the quota was in 1925? 6,200. So essentially, immigration ends to the United States in 1924 for all practical purposes. Now this would have, and papers become required for the first time. Now visas are required to enter the country. Now a lot of folks, this is something we often hear at the museum, people will say to us, well, you know, my grandparents came here legally. And I'm like, well, when did your grandparents come? And people say, no, my grandparents came in 1905. I'm like, of course they came here legally because there were no laws in 1905. Everybody, unless they were Chinese, was coming here legally in 1905 because there was no law about immigration unless you were Chinese until 1924. Which, by the way, 1924 is when they broadened the Chinese Exclusion Act to include all Asians. So, 1924 is probably the most important year in American immigration history. Because you know why? Because the Nazis are coming. And they can't, because we have quotas that prevent them from leaving and coming to our country. And you know the results of that. One of the stories we tell in the museum about this, the impact of the National Origins Act, is the story of this family, the Baldizzi, Adolfo Baldizzi. He was an Italian immigrant who came to America in 1923. Like many immigrants, they often sent the husband ahead of time to get a job, get an apartment, set up the home, get things ready for the family. And then he sent for his wife in 1925. The problem is, in 1924, the law has changed. So his wife, Rosaria, who's on the right, has to sneak into America illegally. Somehow she gets a fake passport and enters the United States, where she proceeds to live illegally for 20 years. The Baldizzis actually do not show up in the 1930 U.S. Census, which we discovered from their daughter, who was still alive when we started the museum, was because they were hiding from the authorities because they did not want the authorities to know that Mrs. Baldizzi was undocumented. And it would be 20 years until she'd be able to get her citizenship. Now, we've heard a lot over the last year about the so-called chain migration. This is a classic example of chain migration. Mr. Baldizzi coming first to set up a home for his family, sending for his wife later, but the laws change in the meantime. And suddenly they go from simply reuniting their family to being undocumented. The same situation many families find themselves in today. This changes somewhat under President Harry Truman. President Truman was a big advocate of immigration. And he could not change the quotas, but what he did was, after World War II, he said, we are going to give priority within the quota system to people who've been displaced by the war. You have to remember, after the war, there were literally 10 million displaced people in Europe. People who had lost their homes and had been forced to flee because of the war. And Truman was very concerned about these folks. He wanted to give them a chance to start a new life in the United States. And he said, we're going to move these displaced people to the front of the line. One of the stories we tell about in the museum is one of those families, Kalman and Rivka Epstein. Kalman, the man on the right, had survived Auschwitz. His wife on the left, Regina, had survived Theresienstadt. They were not together at that time. They both had their own families. Their families died in the camps. They survived. They go to a displaced persons camp in West Germany where they meet in 1946. They fall in love and they get married in 1946. It turns out that Kalman has an uncle who had immigrated to the United States before the quotas had been passed. He had immigrated in the 19-teens. And President Truman passes this executive order in 1947 in which he says, displaced people, if they have a sponsor in the United States, get to move to the front of the line. Kalman writes his uncle and says, please sponsor me to come to the United States. And his uncle does. Kalman and Regina Epstein move to the United States in 1947. They have their first daughter, Bella, in 1948. And their apartment is the most recent exhibit we have opened at the museum. Now, because so many refugees were still in need, President Truman was able to persuade Congress to pass the Refugee Resettlement Act in 1949, which was the first act allowing refugee resettlement in American history, and it allowed 800,000 people to be exempted from the quota system and to come to the United States as refugees in the post-World War II era. But by and large, not many people were immigrated to the United States in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Things changed in 1965. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson signs the Hart-Celler Act. You can see him signing it here in New York Harbor at Ellis Island with the city in the background. And in 1965, the United States liberalizes its immigration laws again. What it does is it repeals the Quota Acts, it repeals the Asian exclusion laws, and it prioritizes family reunification. It says we're going to let people immigrate here. The first people we're going to let immigrate here are people whose families are already here. That's how Mrs. Wong gets to come, because her husband is an American and he's already here. So she's able to come and to bring her children to the United States. This leads to the current immigration boom, which is going on in the United States, because the laws were significantly liberalized in 1965. Now you can see the impact of the laws I've been talking about on this chart. This chart shows you the percentage of people in America who are foreign born. All right? It peaks in the second decade of the 20th century, at the peak of that wave of Jewish and Italian immigration. At about 15% of the population is foreign born. 1924, the new act gets passed, and look, the percentage of Americans who are foreign born drops really dramatically. Until 1970, it's only 4.7% of the population. Literally, the 1924 National Origins Act cuts the percentage of foreign-born Americans by 2/3. So if you're my age, I'm 55, when you were growing up, you probably didn't know many immigrants because there weren't many immigrants in the country. If you were my grandparents' age, you probably knew a lot of immigrants. And if you're their age, you probably know immigrants because with the liberalization of the laws, the percentage of Americans who are foreign-born has begun to go back up. But what's interesting is, if you listen to the media nowadays, you would think we are being overrun with foreign immigrants. It is actually still lower than it was throughout most of our history. If you look back from the 1860s to the 1920s, it's about 13 to 15% of our population is foreign born. So for 60, 70 years, it's 13 to 50%. We're still not up to that level now. So the notion you're hearing in the media that America is being overrun with immigrants is actually not consistent with our history. Levels of immigration today are still not equal to the levels of immigration in the past. But I think it's a really important thing for people my age to realize that it has changed really dramatically since we were kids, and that might account for why a lot of people my age and older feel like America is being overrun by immigrants. Because compared to the percentage when we were children, it is significantly higher. But it is not as high as it was at the peak of America's golden years of immigration in the late 1800s and early 1900s. I put the clicker somewhere. There it is. Things have changed really dramatically in the last few years with regards to the country's policies towards immigrants. As you know, President Trump, in his first week in office, put in place an executive order that would have put in place a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. This was struck down by the courts, but then a partial shutdown of Muslims entering from 7 specific countries was passed and has been upheld by the courts later. So this is an interesting contrast because many of the Muslims that are banned from coming now are from countries like Syria, where they are coming as refugees. So this is the exact opposite of the executive order President Truman put in place in 1947 when he said we are going to give priorities to refugees and displaced people. Our executive order today actually says we are going to stop refugees and displaced people rather than put them at the front of the line. And some of the rhetoric we've heard out of the president has been very different than we would have heard out of, say, President Truman. Saying about immigrants, for instance, these people aren't people, these are animals. What's interesting, though, is that despite all of the controversy, America is a nation of immigrants. 44% of Americans are either immigrants, have an immigrant parent, or have at least one immigrant grandparent. I do this with every audience I have. So keep your hand up. Are any of you immigrants? Keep your hand up. Do any of you have an immigrant parent? Do any of you have an immigrant grandparent? Look around this room. We are a nation of immigrants, despite what rhetoric you hear in the news. And immigrants have helped build America. I love this statistic. 41% of Fortune 500 companies were started by immigrants or the children of immigrants. Anybody use Google today? Thanks, Sergey Brin, an immigrant. Anybody got an iPhone? Thanks, Steve Jobs, the child of Syrian refugees. Anybody want to own a Tesla? Can't afford to get the damn things, but you can thank Elon Musk, an immigrant. We can go on down the line. But immigrants have always been part of America. We've had a love-hate relationship with immigrants from the beginning, all the way back to Benjamin Franklin. But immigrants have always been part of this country, they've been integral to this country, and they have helped build this country. And that is the thought I want to close and leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Now we'll turn it over to the student panelists. About a half hour or so, we practiced and timed ourselves over and over yesterday, and then we should have a little bit of time for question and answer as well. We'll stop around quarter of, 10 of. I know, Kevin, you have a commitment after, so we appreciate you fitting us in. But we'll turn it over at this point to our student panelists, and we'll start with Wilson. I've got a, well, I had it up, but I think when we tried to,
You can just close my presentation.
Yeah,
I
close.
think it'll come back on your screen.
I'm not seeing it.
Upper right-hand corner.
Oh, is it a mirroring? Okay.
Okay, so what I would like you all to do with our imaginary slideshow right here, and what I was going to have up, is pretend like you're a Martian, coming to the world for your first time on a vacation. Arriving at night, the image that you see before you is not one defined by borders, not one defined by walls, but rather one defined by a sea of lights, a live-action map of human interactions and development. The world you see is much different than the one that you perceive from the atlases that you might look at. We already live in a borderless society. We have just yet to realize what that actually means. In a world increasingly defined by advancements in technology and shifts in cultural dynamics, our stringent conventional understandings of citizenship are no longer indicative of the identities we maintain or the realities we hold. Borders put concrete, finite barriers on a humanity whose characteristics and behavior are not meant to be segmented or divided. Given the rapid rate of advancement in infrastructure development and innovation in the digital technology sphere over the past half-century, two people on either end of the planet can communicate in ways unprecedented from any time in the course of human history. In the year I was born, the median nation had 7 cell phones per 100 people. Now that same country has 114, more cell phones than people. The world now wields 2.6 billion interconnected Facebook users and 3.2 billion internet users. While over the course of 70 years, the cost of phone calls between New York and London has fallen from just over $75 to just under 21 cents. The gravity of these statistics informs us of the increasingly tight-knit community our global technological infrastructure is in the process of creating. This process is not only limited to technology, though. Cultural immersion through international travel has only risen in response to similar trends in the patterns of how we move. Over the course of the past 70 years, average prices of flights across the Atlantic have fallen nearly 3,000%, from nearly $3,000 to just under $300. Likewise, in the year 1990, a mere 3% of the US population had passports. Today, that number stands at nearly 50%. And perhaps most shockingly of all, the number of Chinese passengers on flights last year stood at 550 million, 200% higher than just 10 years ago. In short, changes in technology have undoubtedly overthrown the archaic role of borders as lines separating a populace from the world at large. However, this is not simply limited to technology. Changes in global culture have similar, if not more pronounced effects. Much of the original logic employed for the creation of nations was to consolidate ethno-linguistic groups. Considered beneficial to economic productivity and necessary for the prevention of ethnic conflict, this strategy has long been employed by state builders and imperialists alike. However, its dangers far outweigh its benefits. Take as an example the phenomenon of the Uyghurs, an ethnic group of the western Xinjiang province of China. Practicing both Islam and Buddhism, and of both Turkic and Han Chinese descent, the Uyghurs are a population that do not fit into our conventional, rigid definitions of statehood in ethno-linguistic terms. As such, they have faced rampant political persecution and re-education in government-run internment camps. Due to their lack of cultural cohesion with the eastern part of the country, they have been persistently threatened and tormented. Though the Chinese government certainly deserves blame for the abuses against the Uyghurs, their plight ultimately is derived from a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of human culture. As one can see in an ethno-linguistic map of Asia, culture and language exists on a fluid spectrum not easily split by borders into united and centralized nation states. According to a recent poll conducted by the BBC of nearly 20,000 residents in 18 countries around the world, 51% of the global population now more strongly identifies as a global citizen than a citizen of an individual country. Most interesting of all, however, is the discrepancy of these results. With emerging economic superpowers China, India, and Nigeria leading the pack with over 65% of respondents choosing the international alternative, the United States lags behind with a mere 43% of respondents touting global over national identity. These results provide powerful insights as we ponder the nature of citizenship in modern society. Is citizenship an idea derived from birth or an indication of cultural cohesion? Study of the world reveals that these issues that once drove us apart increasingly have the opposite effect. Our conventional ideas about national identity no longer coincide with the patterns of our lives. To embrace the emergence of the new era of global citizenship, we must not fall prey to the xenophobic and protectionist sentiments that drive us to draw lines in the sand of our humanity. The universality of human existence is incohesive with the fractured society borders inevitably drive us to create. To successfully alter our understanding of citizenship in line with the realities of human existence, we must stop viewing immigrants as outsiders and continuously see them as part of an increasingly integrated global fabric of interconnections based in technology, infrastructure, and intercultural exchange. The rise in populist political movements from Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey to Marine Le Pen in France are indicative of an international uncertainty regarding what the future holds. Though we may like to believe that tariffs, border walls, and travel bans can protect us from the uncertainty of the new era of global citizenship, they are ultimately small hiccups in the inevitable process of globalization. Whether we like it or not, the world is becoming smaller. The only question is whether the United States will embrace the New World Order or step aside from its position as the chief broker of peace and prosperity abroad. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. All right. Hello, my name is Bridget Snyder, and today I'll be talking about asylum seekers. So when I first heard we were talking about immigration, I was immediately drawn to the news cycle, the caravan, the wall, the Muslim ban. It was easy to be caught up in the headlines, but as I began to research these issues, I was struck by the why. Why do people immigrate to the U.S. illegally? And why, as Isabel Lilly will speak on later, given that naturalization is proven to increase GDP and tax revenues, do undocumented immigrants remain so? I had to study the barriers to legal immigration in order to establish ideas for long-lasting solutions. Here's the wide-reaching problem I found within our system: endless bureaucracy. Yes, I know, there are two inherent problems when I make this broad claim. Firstly, there are people who believe that immigrating to the country should be difficult. And to a certain extent, everyone can agree there should be checks and documentation. However, our current process is counterintuitive. We have a patchwork system that promotes illegal immigration and stands in stark contrast to the values of most Americans. Secondly, mine is admittedly a very broad claim about a complicated issue. So to substantiate, I will tell you the story of a true denied asylum seeker. And this is her picture up here. An unnamed victim of sexual, physical, and domestic abuse, this woman came to the U.S. to join her parents in South Florida and free her precarious domestic life. No, under normal circumstances, or even last year, her claim for asylum would have been recognized. Under current law, however, in order for a person to claim asylum status in the U.S., they must be victimized as a recognized minority of a group, so a race, religion, or other inherent characteristic. Cologne, the woman's lawyer, states that most judges under the current duress of our system deny all claims of domestic abuse and gang violence, the #1 issue and reason for asylum seeking. Immigration claims have actually decreased since 2016. However, denial rates for asylum seekers have skyrocketed to 70%. The applicant provided vivid stories of the rape that caused her son to be born prematurely and the abuse inflicted upon their 3-year-old infant. That's when I decided to go to the police, she stated. The woman did try to resolve the issue in her native country, Nicaragua. After she filed a claim, the police acquired no further testimony or charges against her boyfriend, even alerting him to the claim filed against him. Unable to protect her own life and that of her infant son within her country, the unnamed woman made a claim to asylum and hired a lawyer from the NGO, Cologne. With all this in mind, how can we as a nation not find unprosecuted gang violence and domestic abuse as legitimate claims for asylum? Now let's raise the stakes. You have arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border as a Latin American migrant and plan to enter the process as an asylum seeker. Get ready for the process. It's long. After surrendering yourself to Border Patrol agents, you are turned over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement to wait for a credible fear interview in an immigrant detention center. If the asylum officer deems the fear uncredible, then the migrant can appeal out of court to overrule their decision. If the asylum official deems it credible, the migrant still has to attend the same court to affirm the official's decision. The thing is, this court this early in the process is only to qualify for the asylum application. This is where most migrants need to hire an attorney, which costs $1,000 at a minimum, to either appeal the judge's ruling or continue with the laborious application requiring official documentation that many, if not most, asylum seekers do not have access to. The system of asylum seekers inherently favors those wealthy enough to hire legal help and sit through the years-long process of pertaining long-term status. In the end, most represent themselves presents its own set of problems, particularly if the individual doesn't speak English or is unaware of the clause on generalized violence, which disincluded the woman on the picture I just explained to you. Once the application is submitted, you will have a court case heard by a judge to finally decide whether you are granted asylum. But there's still another but. Time magazine found that U.S. courts denied 88% of asylum seekers from Mexico between 2012 and 2017, and 79% from El Salvador. And furthermore, we only have 334 judges to handle 715,000 cases. Ashley Tabador, president of the National Association of Immigrant Judges, calls for the tripling of their current amount, claiming that the applicant pool has historically been competitive for these jobs anyways. The process of hiring a new immigrant judge has been shortened from over 2 years to 1 year. Due to the current backlog, the wait time on average is 10 months. However, wait times still vary greatly around the country. If you're applying for naturalization, for example, in Twin Cities, you could wait up to 2 years for a court hearing. This is the system our migrant woman is stuck in. The migrant woman was denied because her story was categorized as generalized violence. She appealed the court's denial, but in the meantime is unable to find work because she is not able to obtain a work permit. People are leaving because they are suffering from high levels of violence from gangs and other organized criminal groups. These gangs want to recruit minors. They carry out extortion, kidnapping, and sexually abusing their females. Says Francesca Fontanini, spokesperson for the UNHCR. Instead of denying deserving people on gotcha clauses of meeting a generalized violence requirement, America can extend a hand to those in need and in return grow our economy. Immigrants are self-sufficient, as proven by our wonderful speaker. But when undocumented immigrants come to this country, they are set up for a trap to feed right into the narrative of the day. When they find work, they are underpaid and overworked illegally, taken advantage of by the privilege of society. Why add extra hurdles to the process of desperate people? In terms of solutions, firstly, gang and domestic violence need to be recognized as legitimate forms of persecution, particularly if a case has been filed in the country of origin without any further prosecution. Instead of Trump's proposed solution of no longer allowing those who enter legally a day in court at all, we should prioritize the funding of our immigration courts. Tabador notes, as mentioned before, that the funding for law enforcement has increased, that for immigration courts has remained stagnant, and she summarized it with a pretty funny analogy. So we've seen a situation where, if you imagine a one-lane highway with one exit ramp being now built out to a 3 or 4 lane highway, and the exit remains a single lane, and then trying to blame the exit ramp for the traffic. If nothing else, I hope this forum will detail the overwhelming benefits of integration and give you the drive to vote for representatives who believe in long-term reforms of a system lost to the game of politics. We cannot continue to elect politicians to support a system that ignores the plight of sexual violence victims, that discriminates against survivors, and redirects the conversation to big-ticket items instead of restructuring an outdated system. We have to update this system to match current waves of immigration by voting for people who support hiring more judges, matching funding, and a restructuring of the integral process we all just walked through together. When I started my research, I was drawn to this image of the unnamed migrant woman and her child. Safe, going to school, excited to be here. When we talk about immigration, our solution shouldn't eclipse the human element. Would you tell this woman, seeing her pictures, seeing her son, that she should retreat back to her abusive home? Thank you. I would like you all to imagine you are a child, not even 14 years old, sent away from your homeland by your mother, who filled you with the yearning for freedom and opportunity she promised another nation would provide. However, upon entry, you find yourself met with hostility and skepticism, turned backs and bare walls. The light of opportunity fading as the reality of life in a detention center begins to materialize. Throughout the past few months, immigration detention centers have taken center stage in American news. I was struck by the destitute nature of these centers, by the dehumanization and criminalization of those simply searching for an opportunity of a better life. Sure that this couldn't solely be a national issue, I began to look globally and found similar patterns of malpractice across detention centers worldwide. As a whole, it seems that these centers, instead of acting as gateways to documenting immigrants and establishing residency, are instead acting as one-stop terminals back to the country they were fleeing. So the question remains, what are the pragmatic and logical alternatives to this dehumanizing piece of the immigration process? Before looking into detention alternatives, I decided to look into one country with some of the more notoriously unethical detention centers. The United Nations Human Rights Council has cited various offenses against the Egyptian government for their treatment of detained immigrants. Egypt has been a key transit country for immigrants traveling across Africa and the Middle East, and according to statistics released by the UNHRC, there are about 230,000 registered refugees and asylum seekers in the country. However, under Article 3 of the Law of Entry and Residence, immigration through non-legal ports of entry are punishable through detainment ranging to 6 months, a steep fine, and a criminal trial, where detention and subsequent deportation are a likely result. The same system remains in place for asylum-seeking immigrants as well. According to a report released by the Faculty of Law at Oxford University, for many years, Egypt lacked legitimate detention center infrastructure and instead used prisons, such as the Alexandria Hadja Prison, Port Said Prison, and Tura Prison. In recent years, de facto detention centers of dismal conditions have been raised when police and prison facilities have reached max capacity. However, while the UNHRC representatives having been denied access into multiple detention centers, it is underreported as to what conditions of these centers entail. According to the Egyptian Institute for Personal Rights, certain facilities were riddled with sanitation insufficiencies and insect infestations leading to skin diseases, respiratory, and gastrointestinal illnesses. Accounts by past detainees recount 45 to 60 people per 16 to 30 square meter cell in these prison-based facilities. Immigrants have access to a single toilet and washroom and one UNHRC provided meal daily. Treatment of detainees varies greatly and is largely dependent on the faculty itself. However, reports of abuse and mistreatment have been reoccurring. It is hard to imagine that in 2016, under these conditions, Egypt was the country with the largest number of unaccompanied, undocumented children. To this day, there have been no significant policy changes made to ensure the sanctity of the lives of detained immigrants. Egypt, however, is not an isolated case. Far from it, really. In each country, there is a direct correlation to the increase of immigration to the increase of detention capacity. According to the Journal on Migration and Human Security, the United Kingdom expanded their detention capacity from 205 in 1993 to 3,500 in 2011. The Netherlands increased from 45 in 1980 to 3,310 in 2006. The current detention capacity of Malaysia has skyrocketed to 11,400, Spain to 7,000, and South Africa, whose major detention facility holds 6,500. The United States detention capacity is estimated to be the largest, rising from 6,785 in 1994 to 34,000 by 2013. The photo above depicts the U.S. Customs and Border Protection of the Central Processing Center in McAllen, Texas. As you can see, detainees are packed back to back, wrapped in nothing but a foil blanket.
privacy is non-existent, a sense of individuality entirely diminished. Similar conditions have been reported across the country. A 2017 report released by the Inspector General's Office of the Department of Homeland Security claimed that 4 out of the largest immigration detention centers located in California, New Mexico, New Jersey, and Georgia have failed to meet the basic needs of those detained. The report specifically cites insufficient hygiene supplies, lack of medical care, and the provision of potentially harmful food. It was found in some facilities that detainees were grouped by criminal history. In another, those entering the facility were strip searched, a blatant and embarrassingly unnecessary violation of privacy. Nor did all centers provide proper language adoption services, which revealed the shameful lack of regard for what these immigrants had to say. However, this is not necessarily a recent issue. Reports of the same caliber have been released by the same organization in 2018, and Women's Refugee Committee have claimed their own release of similar reports for years. So the question remaining is, what steps should the global community take in order to implement an improved humanitarian system to take the place of these detention centers? Recently, new ideologies have arisen which claim to take a more holistic and humanistic approach. In the United States, programs which are identified as ATDs, or Alternatives to Detention, have used the guise of humanitarianism and transparency to shield programs such as the Intensive Supervision Appearance Program, as well as the Family Case Management Program. These programs, however, which are organized and supervised entirely by ICE, have been criticized for their prioritization of the bureaucracy of the immigration process over the immigrant themselves. This is where I believe they fail. However, where public support should be aimed is at creating programs more similar to the Alternative Accompaniment Program, in which an immigrant is integrated into American society through placement in a community-based group or nonprofit. These programs would focus on community-based integration, in which an immigrant is truly given the opportunity to thrive and obtain citizenship in a supporting and helpful environment instead of one of fear. It is my hope that through this speech and the rest of the committee, I have made clear that it is now time to put an end to the archaic and inhumane system of detention, of hostile eyes and bare walls, oil blankets and barbed wire, and in turn replace it with humanizing alternatives to immigration detention. Thank you.
Affairs Forum topic, I thought I knew exactly what my angle was going to be. My partner and I had reached an agreement about discussing the economic burdens of undocumented immigration throughout the European Union. However, after thorough research, we have realized that geographically and economically, the United States immigration policy should not be put up for comparison to that of the European Union. Small countries such as Italy are struggling economically due to the mass immigration currently occurring there. This is largely due to the fact that many of these countries in the EU simply have much smaller of an economy. According to the IMF World Economic Outlook database, the United States has a GDP of around $20 trillion compared to Italy's GDP of around $1.5 trillion. Further, Italy simply has run out of space for these undocumented immigrants. According to the economist Frédéric Dauquier, by 2065, Italy will have had around 18 million immigrants, out of the expected 53.7 million total in population. This is around 35% of Italy's projected population. According to the Pew Research Center, however, the United States in 2065 is expected to only have 18% of their population to be immigrants. This shows how the United States is simply not comparable to Italy or most countries in the European Union. America has the capacity to allow more immigrants into their country. There is widespread concern, on the other hand, of the economic pragmatism of immigration, specifically of undocumented immigrants. Many are worried that the government is going to spend nearly $20 billion or more for these undocumented immigrants and nothing will come in turn. But I caution you from forming a grudge against undocumented immigrants because of this financial risk. Every investment pragmatically entails an underlying factor of risk. As a nation with a history full of economic prosperity, the only evidence we have is adding diversity and immigrants to our nation allows us to make economic gains. On a statistical basis, the National Academies concluded that after accounting for an immigrant's descendants, each additional immigrant has a long-term fiscal contribution of $173,000 to $259,000 over 75 years. The net present value for an immigrant with more than a high school education is $198,000. This shows not only are these immigrants remarkably valuable for our economy, but they're also significant
throughout our fiscal system is expected to expand and develop even more. On another note, the role of diversity in the United States workforce is undoubtedly the key to prosperity. According to Forbes magazines, immigrants work largely for successful technological and agricultural companies. Statistics also show how the number of immigrants in the United States workforce continues to grow. In 2000, the percentage of foreign-born workers was at 13.3% in the U.S. In 2016, by comparison, 16.9% of the labor force was foreign-born workers. These immigrants want to work and want to contribute to their nation's new economy. The foreign-born demographic within the workforce is continually growing. I want you to imagine our nation without immigrants. A country without immigrants, according to Forbes, would be a country without 40% of America's billion-dollar startup companies, such as Goldman Sachs, Google, PayPal, eBay, and Tesla. These companies are not only valuable, but they employ a lot of other people. Among privately held billion-dollar startup companies, those with immigrant founders have created more than 1,200 jobs per company. A country without immigrants would be a country without diversity, and thus a country without immigrants would be a country without economic prosperity. As the melting pot of the world, America needs to dig deep into their roots and remember that everyone has a right to live out the American dream legally.
The facts of immigrants in the labor force, as outlined by my partner, provide proof of a stable relationship between economic prosperity and immigration. The majority of economists from both conservative and liberal studies have also found an affinity between the two. Pierre Arrhenius, a labor economist, stated that when immigrants enter the labor force, they increase the productive capacity of the economy and raise the GDP. Their incomes rise, but so do those of the natives. The Brookings Institute also discovered definitive evidence of the positive impact of immigration on government finances and innovation that corroborates Arrhenius' findings. Both sources agree that two major advantages of the influx of immigrants are the creation of an economy with a higher productive capacity and an increased consumer population. According to a 2013 brief by the conservative Manhattan Institute, this is in part due to the fact that immigrants increase economic efficiency by reducing labor shortages in low and high-skilled markets because their educational backgrounds fill holes in the native-born labor market. Such evidence is proof that immigration has become an ingrained contributor to the American GDP. In fact, the U.S. Congressional Budget Office has determined that increased rates of naturalization and allowance of more immigrants across our border will raise the GDP by 0.33 percentage points over the next decade. Opposingly, the deportation of undocumented individuals would reduce the American GDP by 0.27 percentage points per year. Although the increase in GDP is marginal, the reduction in GDP associated with the removal of immigrants is far more troubling. After only 5 years after removal, America would begin to feel the strain of such a depletion. In contrast to the myth of the financial burden of immigration, the Congressional Budget Office's data shows evidence that the only burden on the economy would be if immigrants were to be removed from the United States. According to the BBC, over 75% of immigrants in the United States have at least a high school education. Although many are not educated beyond this and are not highly skilled, they are able to enter the job force with enough skills to be contributing members to society. Statistically speaking, immigrants, both documented and undocumented, work hard in the jobs they are hired for and are more likely to have multiple jobs at once and seek out employment with only a high school education. These immigrants who started with nothing are able to fulfill their American dream to the extent that they become a positive addition to the economy. The United States Office of Homeland Security reported that 118,559 out of a little over 700,000 naturalizations in the U.S. in 2017 were from Mexico. After 2010, Mexican immigrants alone made up 25.3% of total immigrants, as opposed to 50 years earlier where Mexico amounted to 5.9% of all immigrants. The implications behind these numbers, as many have worried, may at first be troubling. It seems that in a nation of immigrants such as ours, a diversified approach to immigration would be ideal. After all, is it really beneficial to naturalize large amounts of people from only a few countries? In the longer term, the answer seems to be yes, as immigrants from those few countries in particular are willing and able to fill gaps in the American labor force by applying for perhaps lower paying and repetitive jobs in the agriculture and textile industries. A highly productive economy with few gaps in the labor force and an increased consumer population is a prosperous economy. As Americans, we are fixated upon the American dream, but while the great debate over moral responsibility in regards to immigration remains both abstract and subjective, we must also be cognizant of the facts and numbers behind these concepts. My fellow panelists have spoken on the moral and emotional reasons for accepting immigration, but even from a factual perspective, as my partner and I have proved, there is reason enough for immigrants. Both mathematically and historically speaking, immigration has remained and will remain a positive factor in our economy. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Roz, and this is my partner, Oscar Cespedes. Today we will be discussing the topic of climate refugees as they relate to immigration. 200 million. That's how many people the International Organization for Migration has predicted will be displaced from their homes due to severe climate change by the year 2050. There is no official definition for the term climate refugee established by the United Nations or any other intergovernmental organization. It is hard to define because its definition would determine who does and who does not qualify as a person who can seek refuge in a country due to climate change making their home no longer habitable. The UN established the qualification of a refugee at the 1951 Refugee Convention. It came to a consensus that only those who have a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion qualify as a refugee. The concept of this definition is that the UN will assist someone whose life is at risk in their current living situation. According to this definition, wouldn't someone whose home has been destroyed by a natural disaster or as a result of our quickly changing climate be considered a refugee? There are people who live in cities that are almost entirely underwater, people who live in conditions of serious drought, and others whose lives are at risk every day because of earthquakes, tsunamis, and tornadoes. How is it that people in situations such as these do not qualify as people who face serious threats to their life or freedom? The issue with the official definition established in 1951 is that climate change wasn't on anyone's radar at that time, let alone people actually being displaced from their homes because of it. The UN standards of a refugee are outdated and should be modified to include those who no longer have a place to live because their homes have been compensated by extreme weather. Historically, we have seen many people who have been forced to migrate. Let's take the Great Famine in Ireland, for example. Between 1845 and 1849, the potato crop failed greatly due to a late blight that destroyed the opportunity to decrease the number of lives that will be lost as a byproduct of climate change. In the context of climate change, in the context of climate refugees, we need to be proactive rather than reactive. As humans, more unites us than divides us. We all need to eat. Families need to feel like their children are protected. Climate refugees will face obstacles to the most basic human needs if this issue is ignored. It is up to the great powers to address the plight of climate refugees in their immigration policies. If they don't, their security may be jeopardized. Terrorist organizations prey on those who are suffering and whose governments have no hope. Is it in anyone's best interest to have up to 200 million people living without hope? Where will they turn? Are we willing to jeopardize global security by ignoring millions of people who we are most responsible for displacing?
Climate change is not real. It is real. It's not a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese or trumped up by the Chinese. It's here, and its biggest problem has arrived. As of right now, there is an average of 24 million people displaced due to climate change, according to the Global International Database on Climate Refugees. The problem is that there is no real plan to take care of climate change refugees. While there may be proposed ideas on how to solve this issue, There isn't a set of guidelines in which nations can implement into law to take care of climate change refugees. For example, the Paris Climate Accord, together with the ICCPR, work to create what is known as a human rights approach, which is a system in which governments ensure that all affected people are engaged in the decision-making, planning, implementation, and the implementation process. There are also the guidelines that were set in place by the United Nations, called the PRP plan, the Plan to Relocation Process. These outlines are recommendations on what nations should do to help address the problem of climate change refugees. These guidelines are educating people on why they need to be relocated, having a secure and welcoming space for refugees, and educating the people of the nation that these refugees are coming into, having a structured time frame and working together with other nations' governments to address and find a solution. Now you might be wondering, what is the solution to this problem, since there is no law internationally? Well, let me tell you the facts. There are three main pillars to solving this issue. First, decision. What this means is nations have to make a decision to undertake the problem of climate change refugees. Second is planning, making sure that each nation has a plan set in place to take care of refugees, whether it is providing homes, providing aid, providing education. We need to make sure that all nations have a law set in place for climate change refugees. And third is implementation. How are we going to implement these new laws into nations? How are we going to take care of refugees in these new nations in a time that we together as a whole truly are not accepting refugees around the world? Implementation means having to work with all nations, making sure that human rights are all protected. So essentially, the stability of the plan is a process of physical relocation and the follow-up and monitoring of the relocation process on a long-term basis. People will be watching, 200 million people to be accurate. They will be watching as they are struggling to survive the disaster that the West has mainly caused. It is up to everyone to plant a seed in a garden that we cannot see. As we continue to discuss the issue of immigration, let us also include climate refugees into that discussion. Our nation's motto is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Will we live up to that when 200 million people are displaced?
Included some pictures of you guys at the conference, and the last thing I said is, after leaving that conference, you feel a little bit better about the future, of the world and the direction. These are our future leaders, and they worked really hard on this and are really articulate, and we want to thank you guys for your hard work. Kevin, I saw you at the Litchfield Historical Society. I didn't think I could love your presentation more, but I did today, and thank you for your thoughts as well and your presentation.